Darkness fell over Okinawa on May 5, 1945. Private First Class Desmond Doss, unarmed, exhausted, and alone, knelt beside a wounded Japanese soldier. The enemy's blood soaked through his torn uniform sleeves. Around him, dozens more waited in the shadows, wounded, desperate, and under orders to fight to the last breath. What Doss didn't know was that some of them still had grenades. This is the story of the longest night of the Pacific War and the medic who refused to see enemies, only patients. The boy from Lynchburg. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7, 1919 in Lynchburg, Virginia. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretched out behind his childhood home, a modest wooden house on a dirt road where the Doss family barely scraped by during the Great Depression. His father, William Thomas Doss, was a carpenter when work was available. But Tom Doss carried deeper scars, invisible ones, from the First World War. He'd served with the American Expeditionary Forces in France, and what he saw in the trenches broke something inside him. He came home angry, haunted, and found solace at the bottom of a bottle. Young Desmond watched his father's pain. He saw how war could hollow out a man from the inside. And one night when Desmond was just 7 years old, that pain nearly destroyed their family forever. Tom Doss came home drunk and got into a violent argument with his brother. The fight escalated. Tom pulled out a pistol. Desmond's mother, Bertha, threw herself between the two men, and young Desmond watched in frozen terror as his mother begged his father not to pull the trigger. Desmond grabbed the gun from his father's hand and ran. He hid it. And he made a promise to God right then and there, a promise that would define the rest of his life. He would never take another human life. Not ever. Not for any reason. The Doss family were Seventh-day Adventists, a Christian denomination that observed the Sabbath on Saturday and took the Ten Commandments literally. Thou shalt not kill wasn't a suggestion to them. It was absolute. Desmond took that commandment more seriously than most. Hanging on the wall of his family home was a framed picture of the Ten Commandments with illustrations. The image next to "Thou shalt not kill" showed Cain murdering his brother Abel. Desmond stared at that picture for hours as a boy. He couldn't understand how anyone could justify taking a life, even in war. But when December 7, 1941 arrived, everything changed. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. America was thrust into World War II. Young men across the country rushed to enlist. Patriotism surged through every town, every home, every heart. Desmond Doss, now 23 years old and working at a shipyard in Newport News, Virginia, could have claimed exemption. His shipyard job was considered essential to the war effort. But exemption felt like cowardice to him. He wanted to serve. He wanted to defend his country. He just wouldn't carry a rifle. On April 1, 1942, Desmond Doss walked into the Army recruitment office and enlisted as a non-combatant. He requested assignment as a combat medic. The recruiter looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "You want to go to war without a gun?" "Yes, sir. I'll serve. I just won't kill." The recruiter shook his head and stamped the paperwork. Desmond Doss was now Private Doss, U.S. Army. He had no idea what hell awaited him.
The Trials of Fort Jackson. Desmond Doss reported to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for basic training in April 1942. From the first day, he was an outcast. The other recruits couldn't understand him. Here they were, preparing to fight the most evil forces the world had ever seen, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And this skinny kid from Virginia refused to even touch a rifle. They called him a coward, a yellowbelly, a Seventh-day Adventist freak. When rifle drills came, Doss stood at attention but wouldn't pick up the weapon. His drill sergeant screamed in his face. His fellow soldiers shoved him, mocked him, beat him in the barracks when the lights went out. One soldier, Clarence Teach Glenn, remembered it years later. "We gave Desmond hell. We thought he was going to get us all killed. We didn't want him in our unit. But Doss wouldn't break. He endured every insult, every beating, every humiliation. He quoted scripture. He prayed. He kept his head down and did every other part of training better than anyone else. Then came the Sabbath issue. Seventh-day Adventists observe Saturday as the holy day, not Sunday. Desmond refused to work on Saturdays. He wouldn't train, wouldn't drill, wouldn't do anything but attend church services. His commanding officers saw this as insubordination. They threatened him with court-martial. His captain, Jack Glover, despised him. Glover was a hardened officer who believed war required warriors, not pacifists. "Doss, you're going to get men killed," he told him. "You don't belong in this man's army." They tried everything to break him. They denied him leave. They assigned him to the worst details: latrine duty, KP, scrubbing floors with a toothbrush. When Desmond applied for a weekend pass to marry his fiancée, Dorothy Shute, they denied it out of spite. But then a strange thing happened. A colonel intervened. Desmond's request for religious accommodation made it up the chain of command, and a senior officer ruled in his favor. Desmond Doss had the legal right to refuse to bear arms and to observe the Sabbath. Captain Glover was furious, but his hands were tied. Desmond Doss would remain in the unit, unarmed. On August 17, 1942, Desmond married Dorothy in a small ceremony. She was the love of his life, a sweet, patient woman who believed in him even when no one else did. She kissed him goodbye and watched him board the train back to base, not knowing if she'd ever see him again. By early 1944, Desmond's unit, Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division, received orders to deploy to the Pacific Theater. They were going to war, and Desmond Doss was going with them. Proving Ground, Guam and Leyte. The 77th Infantry Division landed on Guam in July 1944. It was Desmond Doss's first taste of combat, and it was everything the nightmares promised, and worse. The Japanese had fortified the island. They fought from caves, from trees, from underground bunkers. They launched banzai charges, suicidal mass attacks, screaming "Tenno Heika Banzai, long live the Emperor." Hundreds of Japanese soldiers would rush American lines with bayonets, swords, and grenades, willing to die as long as they took Americans with them. Desmond's unit took heavy casualties in the first days. Men were cut down by machine gun fire, blown apart by mortars, gutted by bayonets. The screams of the wounded filled the jungle. And that's when Desmond Doss became someone different. While bullets snapped overhead, Doss ran into the line of fire. He dragged wounded men to cover. He stopped bleeding with tourniquets. He injected morphine into shattered limbs. He whispered prayers over dying boys who cried for their mothers. The same men who had mocked him in basic training now owed him their lives. Private Clarence, the same man who'd beat Doss in the barracks, took shrapnel in the legs during a firefight. He was bleeding out, screaming, certain he was going to die. Desmond Doss crawled through enemy fire, dragged Clarence to safety, and patched him up. Glenn grabbed Doss by the collar and said, "I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry for what I did to you." Desmond just smiled. "You'd do the same for me." But Glenn shook his head. "No, Desmond, I wouldn't. You're a better man than any of us." On Guam, Doss saved dozens of men. He earned the Bronze Star for valor. His reputation began to shift. The soldiers stopped calling him a coward. They started calling him the medic. But Guam was just the beginning. In October 1944, the 77th Division deployed to the Philippines to participate in the Battle of Leyte. The fighting was even more brutal. The Japanese defended every inch of jungle, every ridge, every village. Typhoons flooded the battlefield, turning the ground into a swamp of mud and corpses. During one engagement, Desmond's unit was pinned down by a Japanese machine gun nest. 4 men were wounded in the open, screaming for help. No one could reach them without being cut to pieces. Desmond Doss didn't hesitate. He crawled through the mud inch by inch while bullets tore up the ground around him. He reached the first man, gut shot, barely conscious. Doss dragged him back. Then he went back for the second, then the third, then the fourth. It took him 6 hours. By the end, his uniform was shredded, his hands were raw and bleeding, and he'd been grazed by bullets twice. But all 4 men survived. His commanding officer, Captain Glover, the same man who tried to discharge him, watched in disbelief. After the battle, Glover pulled Doss aside. "Doss, I was wrong about you," he said quietly. "You're the bravest man I've ever served with." Desmond just nodded. "I'm just doing my job, sir." By early 1945, the 77th Infantry Division had earned a fearsome reputation. They were called the Liberty Division, veterans of some of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific. They'd seen hell and survived. But nothing could prepare them for Okinawa.
Okinawa was the last stepping stone before the invasion of mainland Japan. If the Allies could take Okinawa, they'd have airfields within striking distance of Tokyo. The Japanese knew this, and they were willing to sacrifice every man, woman, and child on the island to stop it. Operation Iceberg, the Allied invasion of Okinawa, began on April 1, 1945. It was Easter Sunday. Over 1,300 Allied ships filled the horizon. The naval bombardment was the heaviest of the Pacific War. The sky turned black with smoke. The 77th Infantry Division landed on April 26th and was immediately sent to assault a 450-foot volcanic escarpment on the island's western coast. The locals called it Urasue Mura Escarpment. The Americans called it something else. Hacksaw Ridge. It was a vertical cliff of jagged rock and coral, pocked with caves and tunnels. The Japanese had turned it into a fortress. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Mortars were pre-sighted on every path. Snipers hid in spider holes. And the Japanese soldiers had orders: no retreat, no surrender. Fight to the last man. The 77th Division launched their first assault on April 29th. They were slaughtered. Men were cut down before they even reached the base of the cliff. Those who made it to the top were met with grenades, bayonets, and flamethrowers. Desmond Doss went up with the first wave. He watched men he'd eaten breakfast with get torn apart. He ran from body to body, trying to save whoever he could, but the casualties were overwhelming. For 5 days the battle raged. The Americans would take the ridge during the day, only to be pushed back by Japanese counterattacks at night. The ridge became a meat grinder. Bodies piled up. The smell of death hung in the air like a fog. By May 4th, the 77th Division had suffered over 1,500 casualties. Morale was shattered. The men were exhausted, traumatized, and running out of hope. And then came May 5th. At dawn, the 77th Division launched another assault. They pushed to the top of Hacksaw Ridge and managed to hold their position through the afternoon. But as the sun began to set, Japanese forces launched a massive counterattack. Hundreds of enemy soldiers poured out of the caves. Artillery rained down. Machine guns raked the American lines. It was chaos. The order came: retreat, fall back, abandon the ridge. The Americans scrambled down the cliff using cargo nets and ropes. Officers screamed for everyone to move. The Japanese were closing in. If they didn't retreat now, they'd be overrun. But as the last of the soldiers descended, someone realized. Dozens of wounded men were still on top of the ridge. They couldn't move on their own. They were too badly injured, and there was no time to carry them down. They were being left behind to die. Everyone except Desmond Doss. When the order to retreat was given, Doss was tending to a soldier with a sucking chest wound. He heard the shouts, he saw the men running, and he made a decision. He stayed. As darkness fell over Hacksaw Ridge, Desmond Doss was alone at the top, surrounded by enemy soldiers, with no weapon, no backup, and no hope of rescue. What happened next would become the longest night of his life.
The longest night. The ridge was silent except for the groans of the wounded and the distant crack of rifle fire. Desmond Doss knelt in the dirt and looked around. Bodies everywhere. Some American, some Japanese. All bleeding, all dying. He whispered a prayer. "Lord, help me get one more. Please, Lord, just one more." And then he went to work. Doss moved through the darkness like a ghost. He crawled from soldier to soldier, checking pulses, stopping bleeding, injecting morphine. When he found a man who could be moved, he dragged him to the edge of the cliff. But how could he get them down? The cargo nets were gone. The ropes had been pulled up. He was 450 feet above the ground with no way to safely lower a wounded man. So, Desmond improvised. He found a rope, tied a bowline knot around the soldier's chest, looped the rope around a tree stump, and lowered the man down, hand over hand. 75 feet. His hands burned, his shoulders screamed, but he didn't stop. When the soldier reached the bottom, medics grabbed him and untied the rope. Doss pulled the rope back up. And then he went to find the next man. One by one, Desmond Doss lowered the wounded off Hacksaw Ridge. He worked for hours in complete darkness. Japanese soldiers moved in the shadows around him. He could hear their voices. He could smell their cigarettes. But he kept working. He treated Americans, he treated Japanese. He didn't care. A wounded man was a wounded man. At one point, Doss found a Japanese soldier, maybe 19 years old, with a stomach wound. The boy was delirious, crying, calling for his mother. Doss didn't speak Japanese, but he didn't need to. He cleaned the wound, wrapped it in bandages, and gave the boy water. The Japanese soldier stared at him in disbelief. Why was this American helping him? Doss moved on to the next patient. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Doss was beyond exhaustion. His hands were shredded from the rope. His uniform was soaked in blood, some of it his own. He'd been running on adrenaline and prayer for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be afraid. But he should have been afraid. Because not all of the Japanese soldiers on that ridge were incapacitated. Some were still armed, some still had grenades, and some had been ordered to kill any American they found. One Japanese soldier, Corporal Shigeru Yoshida, later described what happened in a post-war interview recorded in 1987. He'd been wounded in the leg during the American assault. He'd crawled into a shell crater and waited for darkness. He had a Type 97 hand grenade tucked into his belt. His orders were clear. If captured, use it. Take the enemy with you. When Yoshida saw an American soldier moving through the darkness, he pulled the grenade. He waited for the soldier to come closer. And then, Desmond Doss knelt beside him. Yoshida froze. The American was unarmed. He was a medic. He was treating another wounded Japanese soldier a few feet away, wrapping bandages, giving him water, whispering something Yoshida couldn't understand. Yoshida's hand tightened on the grenade. He could throw it. He could kill the medic and whoever else was nearby. It would be a glorious death, an honorable death. But then, the medic looked at him, made eye contact, and in broken English mixed with hand gestures, asked, "Are you hurt?" Yoshida didn't move. The grenade felt heavy in his hand. Desmond Doss crawled closer. He saw the blood on Yoshida's leg. He reached for his medic bag. Yoshida could have killed him right then. He should have. Those were his orders. But he didn't. Slowly, Yoshida let the grenade roll out of his hand into the dirt. He let the American medic treat his wound. Years later, Yoshida would say, "I was taught that Americans were devils, but that night, I met an angel." Desmond Doss never knew how close he came to dying. He treated Yoshida's leg, gave him morphine, and moved on to the next wounded soldier. He kept going. One more. Just one more. By the time the first light of dawn broke over Okinawa, Desmond Doss had lowered 75 men off Hacksaw Ridge. 75 lives saved in a single night. Some were Americans, some were Japanese. All of them owed their lives to the unarmed medic who refused to leave them behind. When the American forces returned to the ridge at sunrise, they expected to find a massacre. Instead, they found Desmond Doss, covered in blood, barely able to stand, sitting beside the last wounded man. Captain Jack Glover climbed the ridge and saw Doss. He couldn't speak, he just stared. Finally, Glover said, "How many, Doss? How many did you save?" Desmond shook his head. "I don't know, sir. I stopped counting." Someone else counted. 75. It was the single greatest act of battlefield heroism in American military history.
The cost of courage. Desmond Doss's war wasn't over. The Battle of Okinawa raged for another 6 weeks. Doss continued to serve on the front lines, saving more lives, risking his own over and over. On May 21, 1945, Doss was wounded for the first time. A Japanese grenade landed near him during a firefight. He threw himself on top of a wounded soldier to shield him from the blast. The grenade exploded. Shrapnel tore into Doss's legs and lower body. 17 pieces of metal embedded in his flesh. The pain was unimaginable. Medics rushed to help him, but Doss refused treatment. "Take care of the others first," he said through gritted teeth. He waited 5 hours before allowing himself to be evacuated. As he was being carried to the aid station on a stretcher, a Japanese sniper opened fire. The litter bearers dove for cover, dropping the stretcher. Doss rolled off and dragged himself into a shell crater to avoid getting his rescuers killed. And then, while lying in that crater, Doss saw another wounded man nearby, an American soldier shot through the chest. Even wounded, even bleeding, Desmond Doss crawled over to the man and started treating him. A bullet hit Doss in the left arm, shattering the bone. He nearly passed out from the pain, but he fashioned a splint out of a rifle stock, the same weapon he'd refused to carry, and tied it to his arm. Then he crawled 300 yards to the aid station by himself. Desmond Doss's war was over. He was evacuated to a hospital ship, then to military hospitals in Guam, Hawaii, and finally back to the United States. He would spend the next 5 years in and out of veterans' hospitals. The shrapnel wounds healed. The arm eventually recovered some function. But Okinawa gave him something he'd carry for the rest of his life: tuberculosis. He'd contracted it from another wounded soldier he'd treated. The disease ravaged his lungs. Doctors removed 5 ribs and part of a lung in a desperate attempt to stop the infection. Desmond Doss would struggle to breathe for the rest of his days. But he never complained. When visitors asked about his injuries, he'd change the subject. "I'm one of the lucky ones," he'd say. "I made it home." On October 12, 1945, President Harry S. Truman invited Desmond Doss to the White House. In a ceremony attended by other Medal of Honor recipients, Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Doss's neck. Doss was the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the nation's highest military honor. Truman shook his hand and said, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president. Desmond Doss didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd done his duty, nothing more, nothing less. He returned to Lynchburg, Virginia with Dorothy. They bought a small farm and lived a quiet life. Doss rarely spoke about the war. When people asked him about Hacksaw Ridge, he'd give short answers and change the subject. But the soldiers he saved never forgot him. For the rest of his life, Desmond Doss received letters from men whose lives he'd saved. Some were from Americans he'd dragged off the ridge. Some were from Japanese soldiers he'd treated that night. One letter, received in 1992, was from the family of Shigeru Yoshida, the Japanese soldier who'd almost thrown the grenade. Yoshida had died years earlier, but his family wanted Desmond to know Yoshida had lived a long life, married, had children and grandchildren, and he told his family about the American medic who saved his life when he should have been an enemy. Desmond kept the letter in his Bible.
Epilogue. One more. Desmond Doss passed away on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87. He died at his home in Alabama, surrounded by family. Dorothy had passed away years earlier, and Desmond had remarried a woman named Frances. She held his hand as he took his last breath. At his funeral, dozens of veterans attended, men whose lives he'd saved, and their children and grandchildren. They saluted the simple casket draped in an American flag. They told stories of the medic who ran into fire when everyone else ran away. One veteran, now in his 80s, stood at the podium and said, "Desmond Doss showed us that you don't need a weapon to be a warrior. You just need courage. And he had more courage in his little finger than most of us will have in a lifetime." In 2016, director Mel Gibson brought Desmond's story to the screen in the film Hacksaw Ridge. The movie won 2 Academy Awards and introduced a new generation to the conscientious objector who became a legend. Desmond's Medal of Honor is now on display at the National Museum of the United States Army in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Next to it is the battered Bible he carried through the war, stained with blood and dirt, held together with tape. And on the wall beside the display is a simple quote, words Desmond whispered to himself on that dark night in May 1945, words that became his creed for life. "Lord, help me get one more, just one more." Desmond Doss didn't kill a single enemy soldier in World War II, but he saved 75 men on the night the world tried to tear itself apart. And in doing so, he proved that even in the darkest hour, humanity can endure, that mercy is not weakness, and that the true measure of a soldier is not in how many lives he takes, but in how many he saves. One more. Just one more. That was Desmond Doss. That was the medic who treated enemy troops all night, not knowing they had orders to kill him. And that is a story that will never be forgotten.